Hello, and thank you so much for your invitation to be with you at Holy Ground. Right now, I'm doing this talk as a video, which can go on the website ahead of time. I look forward to meeting you in due course. My question is the following. Is religion compatible with social progress? Now, why should I ask this? Well, I'll tell you the backstory and then we can get into it. This comes from an invitation to take part in a very large-scale international project. In 2015 we started. That's a long time ago now. A great deal has happened since. And this was concerned with the contributions of many, many different aspects of social science to the notion of social progress. So I was there in my professional capacity. As many of you know, my professional career was as a sociologist, mostly in the Department of Sociology at Exeter. This enterprise was called the International Panel on Social Progress, IPSP for short. And it produced 3 years later, in 2018, a 3-volume report published by Cambridge University Press, quite big enough to support my laptop while I make this video. So it's a sizable enterprise. The best way to think of IPSP is as a cousin of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which almost everybody's heard of. Why do I say cousin rather than sibling? Well, there's a good reason for this, because our process was very similar. Each of us, or each of the teams, I'll tell you about that in a minute, had to mine their particular subject area and produce findings and results and put them in the public domain to be of use to policymakers, to politicians, to people who were thinking about social progress and how to make advances in this field. But we were unlike the Intergovernmental Panel in that we were not under any political control, nor did we have to produce a unanimous report on the final day. And if you ever follow the climate change debates, you know that there's a big climax in the week in which they're working when they agree their final report. Now, we didn't have to do anything like that. So I think cousin rather than sibling is probably pretty accurate. And if you look at the PowerPoint which Chris has put on the website alongside this video, you'll see a picture of us in Istanbul in August 2015, where we were setting out on this enterprise. Now, clearly, one of the things we really had to tackle first was what did we mean by social progress? It isn't obvious, and the first thing you can do is discount various approaches which are not very helpful. We do need to set aside Enlightenment, that's 18th century European assumptions, that progress is somehow built into history. Quite clearly it isn't. And nor can you simply measure it in economic terms, because that's far more favourable to some people than others, and it discounts the associated costs. I mean, you can get wealthier, but at the expense, say, of the environment. That has happened many times over. And we're trying now to think in a more rounded way. So what we did in the panel was to think, use the notion of a compass as a metaphor. In other words, in thinking about social progress, we were setting a direction, thinking where we were trying to go rather than any fixed points of arrival or departure. Because one thing you discover, of course, is that social progress in one place that feels like progress in one place doesn't feel like progress in another. Now, a very obvious illustration of this is to think of clean water. Now, in the West, rightly or wrongly, we take this for granted until something goes wrong with our water supply, and then we think it's at least the end of the world and probably worse. You stand there cursing at this tap that won't produce anything. But remember that in many, many parts of the world, a supply of clean water would really be a sign of social progress. Even more now, as we think of how many times we're supposed to wash our hands to keep as clear from the virus as we possibly can, and think of that in a refugee camp when you just cannot do this. So social progress is contextual. It's not simply something you can capture once and for all. And you'll see that coming out in my argument in due course. Now, why was I part of this? What was I trying to do with the team that I gathered around me? Well, with my co-leader, who was an American colleague, wonderful colleague, we were charged with leading the team responsible for the chapter on religion within the IPSP. So, broadly speaking, what we had to do was to address the significance of religion as a factor in social progress on a global scale. Now, that's just the way to spend your retirement. It was hugely challenging, but in the end, hugely rewarding. But it was not easy. The first point I want to bring to your attention is that many of our colleagues in the big group were rather perplexed by our presence amongst them. Why was it necessary to include a chapter on religion in this enterprise? What had religion got to do with social progress? And there were two reasons for their question. The first is that many of them, trained in social science, were very persuaded by the notion of secularization, feeling that modern societies, as societies modernized, they would necessarily secularize. Up to a point that has been true in Western Europe. It spreads a little bit out to, say, New Zealand or Australia, Canada, up to a point in the US, but that's a rather different situation. But it is certainly not so in much of the developing world, in the global south, in Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, the Pacific Rim. You do not see many signs of a modern society or an increasingly modern society becoming more secular. There is another reason, though, why they hesitated, my colleagues hesitated, and that was that if religion is still there, or maybe even resurgent in some places, taking ISIS as an example, they were saying, well, what's this got to do with social progress? It looks like it is an antithesis to social progress, that it's damaging any progress that we might be able to make. So they were hesitant for a very different reason. Our challenge, therefore, was to think about these arguments, some of them partial, some of them inaccurate, and where we started was trying to get a very clear definition of religion itself. Now, there's books and stacks of books written about definitions of religion. And here, remember, I'm speaking professionally rather than in my church capacity. So it's not a Christian definition, though Christianity would be included within it. But we thought of religion as a lived, something you do, situated, you do it in a place, and constantly changing reality. It develops as human societies develop, and that religion has as much to do with navigating everyday life as it does to do with anything to do with the supernatural. It's about this world just as much as another world. And so belief and practice are part of this, but the concept we had was much broader than this. How do we live our lives if we are part of religion? What difference does it make to our everyday lives and everyday thinking, reality, practice, friends and neighbours? It's a very broad concept, in other words. So that's where we set out. And I'm not going to do many facts and figures tonight, but I'm going to bring 2 or 3 things to your attention. You'll see the slide on the PowerPoint, and you can go further if you want to. You could also click on the blog, which is referenced on the website, which will take you to an introduction to our work. It's very short, it's only 1,000 words, And that allows you to click into the project itself if you want to. But in it, and crucial to our argument, is the pretty well established fact, it comes from a very sound source, that some 80% of the world's population, of the global population, affirms some kind of religious affiliation. And this proportion is growing rather than declining. So one way or another, for good or ill, religion is going to be central to our discussion. We can't simply ignore it. It may not always be beneficial, but we can't simply factor it out. It's present in the everyday lives of some 80% of the world's population. Interestingly, the notion that it's growing, that percentage, often surprises people. If you look historically, you find the peak of secularity in the modern world is around the 1970s, in other words, before 1989, because vast swathes of the Russian population, Soviet Union then, and China were very, very secular. Now, it's a bit difficult to say what's happened since, because China is now subject to such change, but there has been a big growth in religion in between then and what is happening presently, which may be a new phase of something very secular. But if you think of the former Soviet Union, or now Russia, there's been huge growth. Not always reassuring. Think how close the Orthodox Church is to Putin. That isn't reassuring, but it isn't secularization. And just as an aside, because it's quite interesting, the demographers tell us that in a way the secular or secularity is self-limiting insofar as people who say they have no or little religion tend to have fewer children than people who say that they are part of a religion, or that religion is important in their lives. Now, I think we're going to wait and see what happens to that in the long term. But for the time being, distinguished groups of social scientists go with the fact that this 80% is not going to get smaller anytime soon. Now, we've got 80% of the population, global population, to deal with, and we've got a huge topic. So how do we go about it? Well, we worked up a ladder, if you like. We went from the small scale to large scale. We stepped up from family, sexual, gender issues, intimate issues, through diversity and democracy, how we manage difference. We thought about conflict and peacemaking, healthcare and well-being, and finally into care for the earth or green issues. I can't do all of those in detail, so I'm going to give you just one or two examples, noticing how I do it, how they pick up some of the themes in last month's and the previous month's Holy Ground. If we think of the family and gender and sexuality, think what David Runcorn was saying to us in June. Brilliant talk, absolutely brilliant talk. But when I heard your reactions to it, I smiled, because I thought there are people in the room saying, I think religion is a brake on social progress. It's not going with the flow. It's not reaching out to those who are in same-sex partnerships. It's having a difficulty with something that many people see as progress. In fact, I would nuance one or two of the things that you said. I listened very carefully, because while I feel very strongly that the church should engage and be welcoming and move forward with this change in society, it isn't the case that what society does is necessarily social progress. There are many instances, particularly in social justice, where I feel the church or Christian people should be much more hesitant, should be a prophet, should challenge. So simply following society isn't necessarily the right thing to do, but nor is necessarily resisting when you've thought through the issue and you think, yes, this is a better way. So think of that aspect of what I'm saying in terms of what David was saying just a month ago. Now, if you think about diversity, religious diversity, and forms of governance like democracy, how do religious people stand alongside that? There's certainly some kinds of religion that seem to be very much resisting this kind of thing. But one of the ways we began to think about diversity, living with difference, was to think of the concept of street level ecumenism. How do people get along together? How do they rub along together? Obviously, interfaith dialogue and that kind of connections are very, very important in this. But even more important are just everyday interactions and finding examples where people have learned to do this and are doing it in their everyday lives and supporting neighbours and friends in difficult circumstances. Religion is not inimical to democracy, but some forms of religion find that relationship more difficult than others. If you turn to conflict and peacemaking, the best way to really think this through is to think about your question. You often hear people say, oh, religion causes conflict. Or does religion cause conflict? It's much more enlightening to say, in what circumstances is religion likely to become involved in conflict or tangled up in conflict? Because if it does, that conflict is often much more difficult to solve. You often find that religious and sometimes negative forms of religion rush into a vacuum when a secular autocracy has collapsed. Now, religion is not causing that collapse. That was a secular autocracy. Think of Libya, think of Egypt. And you get a vacuum into which various forces come, some of them motivated by religion. But ask the right question and remember that religious people are also peacemakers. Think of South Africa. Now, apartheid is very strongly linked to forms of Calvinism that evolved in South Africa. That's not really a good memory for people who are thinking theologically in what seems now to be very distorted ways. But then think of Archbishop Tutu and everything he did to enable South Africa to emerge from that situation. You have both sides of the question. Now, when we come to healthcare and well-being, I'm going to pause in a moment just to take and think about where we are with the current pandemic. How is religion playing into that in various ways? But first, just recall what happened in West Africa when Ebola was the concern rather than COVID. Now, one of the reasons why Ebola was very, very difficult to eradicate, because it was being passed on, it's very contagious, because of certain burial practice, particularly in Muslim communities. But what the Muslim leaders did in West Africa was to legitimate, to say we must just stop doing this for the time being. We will have dignified burial, but we will refrain from touching the body and washing and that kind of thing. And it was this that made the material difference to enable those communities to emerge from a time of crisis. And nobody else in that community could have done it. It's a very, very interesting story. You can find the references if you want to take that further. And if I'm thinking of care for the earth, think of the Pope Francis' encyclical called Laudato Si. How a religious leader brings this new dimension to climate change, hugely, hugely welcomed by the scientific community. Again, you can find the references and see the journal article in a very prestigious scientific journal that says this is just great. The science is good. And the other thing that happens is the echo chamber is much, much enlarged because of a major religious leader bringing this to the attention of his faithful. So let me continue now and just say a little bit more about how the whole package comes together, and then we'll think of how it works with COVID. Break down religion a little bit into various dimensions. Religious ideas which motivate. Religious practices which shape ways of life. Religious communities which mobilize and extend the reach of social change and social progress. And religious symbols and leaders which inspire and legitimate call to action. This is a powerful package, remembering, of course, that it can be put to good, social progress, or to ill. We need to pay attention. Now let's just conclude by thinking of those 4 elements in terms of COVID-19. Think of religious ideas to motivate. Love your neighbour. That's the micro level. All of us can do that. And there's many, many instances of church people, among many others, doing just that. But the big question, of course, is social justice and global justice. Last night on a webinar, I heard Davie talking precisely about social justice and global justice and how we need to think in big scale terms about the pandemic and how it's affecting people in much poorer societies than ourselves. Now, there's a good instruction in scripture and in religious teaching to tell us to do just that. Thinking of our religious practices which shape our way of life, thinking of all the new ways in which we've had to do this and how to express these online, some of which are just brilliant. The one that will never leave me in terms of realising the power of this was the one that was done on Mental Health Sunday, done by out of the Diocese of Exeter, which was nice, by somebody with medical training as well as being a priest. It was inspirational. And why would you ever do that again in any other way? Because of so many people you can reach on an online live stream and recorded for subsequent use. Top class. Religious communities to mobilise and extend the reach of change. Religious people have high motivations. They are also supplied naturally, because of what religions are, with networks through which to express them. That's a very powerful combination. Yes, help your neighbour, but through networks which are there for the asking. And think of all the food banks, think of the Trussell Trust, think of how many churches and religious groups have been at the heart, and mosques and gurdwaras have been at the centre of programmes to enable people to be fed when they otherwise would have nothing. But remember, you don't only disseminate food, you can disseminate ideas. That's what happens with the Pope's encyclical. He does 2 things in that. He spreads the word, and he turns a scientific question about climate change into a moral issue, because he tells us that if we do nothing, it will be the poor that suffer. He is a religious leader, a prophet. It is that people like him who legitimate calls to action. One thing prophets do is to rethink the future. Think of what the BBC was doing last week. Rethinking the future. That's part and parcel of social progress. And churches are very well placed to play their part. Thank you.